Hello, good evening everybody, and welcome to what is one of our most eagerly anticipated monthly lectures this year with CAS MUDDE, who is Stanley Wade Shelton Professor of International Affairs, the University of Georgia, Athens, Georgia, as well as, and I didn't know this, distinguished research professor there as well. CAS, of course, is very well known also for his writings in various newspapers, perhaps most prominently for this audience in The Guardian. And he will be, after giving a talk, he will be in conversation with Ivan Krastev, who is now the IWM Albert Hirschman Permanent Fellow. After that, there will be a chance for questions from the audience as well. But I am really looking forward to this, and so I won't detain you any longer, and hand over to Ivan.
Thank you very much. We're very happy that you're here. And normally in any introduction you're saying that your speaker is very prominent and outstanding. This time it's true. He is. And he's really extremely important because to a certain extent, academically, he's one of the very few people who shaped the way we're talking about the far right today. Starting with early work on populism and extreme politics and others. I just want to make three things which in my view are important for the conversation, and I'm not going basically to read his CV, which you probably know. But first, he has this very rare position of somebody who is very strong in political theory and doing a lot of empirical work. Secondly, normally when people work on something, they know very well one place. He's very comparative. He knows Western Europe for sure. He's Dutch. He has been working on basically right-wing parties in Eastern Europe. And then now he's in Georgia, and the United States also helped him to develop his expertise. And his latest book is on the settlement movement in Israel. So from this point of view, this is really something that allows him basically to have a perspective which is trying to grasp a phenomena. And my last point is also that when you're writing about right-wing parties, populism, and so on, it's very interesting, basically, where you're positioning itself. And on this, I do believe he's also very interesting. He's a very political person, and everybody who is reading his column, he's probably studying them in the way you're studying an enemy, but he's never going for cliches that are very popular in this type of a discourse. And I found this particularly important. And before giving him the word, I'm going to quote the character of Mussolini in a mini-series, The Son of the Century, that the Italians did, who said, "Democracy is very lovely, and democracy gives us a lot of freedoms, including the freedom to destroy itself." So from this point of view, Cas, it's you to tell us how it's going to happen.
Thank you very much. It's quite an introduction. Thank you, Ivan. I do want to acknowledge the very tragic day. Today, it is a bizarre experience to come from a country that has many school shootings. We had one pretty close to where we live, half a year ago, not even. You know, there are daily school shootings. It's very tragic to see it in Graz. What I'm going to do, let me first preface where I position. So my argument that I made in the book The Far Right Today is that we're in the fourth phase of the post-war far right, and that requires a little bit of understanding. I won't go into detail, but in 1988, a German political scientist, Klaus von Beimer, wrote about the three waves of right-wing extremism in post-war Europe. And that was, of course, Western Europe, because at that point in time, Eastern Europe didn't have elections. The first wave was what he called neo-fascism, and that was kind of remnants of the past, didn't go anywhere electorally. That was roughly, he wasn't so good in the in the chronological part, but we put that on it, let's say 1945, 55. Then from 55 to 80, we had the second wave, which was the transition between, let's say, the remnants of historical fascism and a truly post-war far right. And so what you had in that period were parties like the NPD in Germany, which had a lot of people who were linked to the Nazi regime, but also people who had not. It had issues linked to that, most notably amnesty for collaborators. But it also had new post-war issues, most notably immigration. And then in the 1980s started the third wave, which was the first truly post-war wave. The vast majority of the people who were involved in the parties had nothing to do with fascism. And the issues that they addressed were not so much anymore about the past, but were about the present. Now, very simply stated, the third phase saw the far right as external, as small, as outside, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, as challenging the system from outside. I argue that around 2000, we get into the fourth phase. I actually, in my book, write about waves. I think phases are better. Waves come and then recede. Certainly, the third wave never receded. It's also important that when we talk about waves or phases, it doesn't mean that every country is in it. So, for example, in the first wave, there were only a few countries that had far-right parties. Second, the same, even the third. I think truly the 21st century is the first one where almost every country in Europe, at least, has a strong or a relevant far right, but it's still exceptions, Ireland or Iceland. But what is most important about the fourth phase is that the relationship to the mainstream has changed, and I will talk about that. And so I think there are three key changes compared to the third phase. First, within the so-called mainstream. Second, within the far right, perhaps the least actually there. And then in the relationship between the mainstream and the far right. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to focus on four, what I believe are outdated beliefs. Some were more true than others. Some were probably never really that accurate, but certainly not today anymore. Some were accurate for the third phase, but not for the fourth. First, normal pathology thesis. The second is the belief that there are clear boundaries between the mainstream and the far right. The third is very political sciencey, but actually very dominant in the media discourse. It's what we call the Downsian paradigm. And then the fourth, which is a little bit sensitive and I think could be discussed a little bit more, which is the idea of liberal democratic hegemony. There's a lot of big words, I will explain them. First of all, very short note, I can talk endlessly about terminology, but I won't. But this is my outline. So I use the distinction left and right in the way that the Italian political philosopher Norberto Bobbio used it, which is almost a kind of a meta interpretation of left and right. It's not socioeconomic, it's not about religious, secular. It's actually about egalitarianism. And for the right, in all its forms, society is unequal. But that is natural. Whether it's given by God or by nature or whatever it is, that is how society is and should be. And it's not up to the state to make society more equal. On the other side are all the left-wing ideologies which believe that these inequalities are actually created and that the state should be used to make a more equal society. I am, however, not interested in the whole right. Pretty much the right, the traditional or mainstream right, as we used to call them, is outside of my view because I focus on what is called the far right, which combines both the extreme right and the radical right. Now, the extreme right is simple. they're anti-democratic in essence. What that means is that they do not believe that people should elect their own leaders. And this, of course, is historical fascism. The quote from Ivan says it, but if you look at what Mussolini and Hitler said about democracy, they by and large said that it was rule of the mediocre person. Now, the extreme right has obviously a huge stigma, and while it still exists in the post-war period, there's almost no one who will openly claim to be anti-democratic. What we see today much more are radical right parties and politicians, and they claim to support the essence of democracy, popular sovereignty and majority rule, so that people elect their own leaders. But they have problems with what is broadly called liberal democracy, sometimes constitutional democracy, which combines that majority rule with minority rights, separation of powers, rule of law, things like that. The far right is a combination of these two. I started to use the term much more because actually in the early 21st century we had the first extreme right parties that became electorally successful. And Golden Dawn in Greece was the prime example, but one is much closer to Vienna, which is various versions of neo-fascist parties, our Slovakia, Republika, whatever. And so at that point in time, I thought, look, these parties are fundamentally different ideologically, but they work roughly the same. They attract the same type of audiences, etc. Today, actually, the term far right has become more useful to describe individual actors, and I will talk about that because the differences between extreme and radical are really disappearing quickly, and not just on the margins of politics, but actually at the heart of far-right politics. Note 2, I think it is increasingly problematic to speak about the far right, because the far right doesn't really exist anymore. That is an idea of the third phase, where you had relatively small parties that were outside of the mainstream that were trying to get in. And so we had a lot of theories that were about protest and all these kind of things. And we saw this discourse very strongly during COVID. And so the media has only two narratives about the far right, which they usually call populism, which is a euphemism. And that is they either are taking over the world or they're dying. There's never anything in between. And sometimes journalists are actually starting to write an article about that they're taking over the world, but then a party in a prominent country loses, and they just write the other article. COVID showed that it's much more complex, because directly there was this argument that, well, the far right is going to win because people are upset about the measures. But at the same time, the far right is in power in Hungary and Poland. And so why would the far right win from protest against these measures, which they introduced? So when you think about the far right today, you have extreme right, radical right. You have organizations like the BJP in India, which allegedly is the largest political party in the world with more than 100 million members. And you have the Party for Freedom in the Netherlands, which has one member, Geert Wilders. Right? You have a president like Jair Bolsonaro who didn't have a party. You also have collective leaderships, whereas others are just leader is the party. You have electoral support hovering nowadays between almost 50% and under 1%. You have parties that are in political power that have never been in political power. You have parties that are 7 years old and are 5 years old. Obviously, these are very fundamental differences in how these parties operate. Like a party that has 100 million members, has been around for 70 years, has been in power very often, is going to operate differently than a party of like 12 people in a basement that has just started. So we have to be careful with talking about the far right as a homogeneous block, and at the same time, I am going to do that probably. Now, let me start with the first thesis that I think is wrong and at the same time pretty much unknown, because almost no one writes about it in the term. So the term normal pathology was used in a very obscure German language article in 1967, but has informed some of the key works on the far right by Hans-Georg Betz or Herbert Kitschelt and others. And so it is a kind of a meta-theory of the third phase of the far right, and it holds that the far right is marginal and pre-modern. The idea is that far right ideas are from a pre-modern period, unrelated to what contemporary democratic societies are about. And the only people who support them are people who can't really cope with modern life. Now, you might notice that there is a fair amount of elitism in this theory. There's actually a fair amount of elitism in the whole approach to the far right. The far right's always supported by the other. Mostly people who are not like us and not as smart that they can see the problems. This was very much that thesis. It was strongly influenced, as most of the work in the third phase, by Nazi Germany, the work on Nazi Germany. And the idea was the far right, under normal circumstances, just hangs out. Kind of irrelevant, because these people going to die, they don't really matter. The only time that they can become big is during a crisis, right? And that is, of course, like the Hitler fear. Now, the problem with crisis is that crisis is one of the vaguest terms in political discourse and political science discourse. It's actually, by and large, never defined. We look back and then we say that was a crisis because then things happened and they happen after a crisis. We've had quite a lot of crises that are at least as big as others that did nothing. The biggest problem, though, is that even during the third phase, the far right was never a normal pathology. What we found was that, first of all, the ideas of the far right were actually very much connected to ideas of the mainstream. So the core of the far right, as I define it, is nativism, which is a xenophobic form of nationalism, which best caught by the infamous German slogan of the early 1990s, Deutschland den Deutschen, Ausländer raus. So Germany for the Germans, foreigners out. Now that in itself sounds extreme, or at least it used to sound extreme. But actually, the idea of the nation state, that every nation would have its own state, and therefore a monocultural state, is the foundation of the modern state system, is enshrined in the UN Charter, and many countries claim to be nation states. Now, the nation state is not the same as nativism, but to a certain extent, the nation state is Deutschland den Deutschen. The nativism is Ausländer raus. And so clearly they are connected. The same for authoritarianism, which is a core concept of both conservatism and Catholicism. The idea of populism, particularly the distrust of the elite, is very foundational to all kind of understandings of politics. And so in a bit too clever play of words, because I believe that kept me from being cited more, I called it a pathological normalcy, by which I meant that the far-right ideas are a radical interpretation of mainstream ideas. And the other thing that we found is that actually authoritarian nativism, populism are not marginal in the population. They're roughly supported by, depends on the country and the feature, between 30 and 50, and sometimes if you think about anti-immigration positions, 70% of the people. If you look early 1990s, Central Eastern Europe, all kind of indicators of xenophobia were very, very high, but not only there. So in the third phase, right, normal pathology was already wrong. In the fourth phase, pretty much many ideas of the far right, particularly around nativism, have become the mainstream. They're not a radicalization anymore, they are the mainstream. In fact, they have become even worse, common sense. Common sense is a very interesting concept that populists use a lot, but that kind of lifts something out of the ideological realm. So it becomes, if Gramscians would say, hegemonic above discussion. Common sense is the position that multiculturalism has failed. That has been declared now in so many countries by so many politicians that we don't even have a debate anymore. Like, if I would write an op-ed for a Dutch newspaper arguing that multiculturalism has been a success, then they would only publish it because they would get so much responses to it saying that I'm crazy. Like, we have no debate about multiculturalism having succeeded or not. It has failed, and we now move on how to solve that problem. Right? It is important, though, that we don't overstate the success of the far right. Yes, the far right has been very successful in pretty much overtaking and dominating the immigration and integration debate. In terms of authoritarianism, they have been much less influential, partly because authoritarianism runs very deep within mainstream politics. Think about all the responses after 9/11. But if you look at the last European elections, they were interesting. The tone is always set by the European People's Party, which the media like to call the center-right group. It very much is a right-wing group, but it is conservative and Christian Democrats. They had three themes: immigration, absolutely adopted, like just by the far right. All the terminology was far right. The second was climate change, where they also had moved to the far right. They were largely undoing their own climate program to get Ursula von der Leyen re-elected. And then the third one, which was very important too, was actually defense and security, about Russia, Ukraine, rearming. On that, the far right is completely without influence. In fact, the far right has copied the positions of the mainstream in most cases. Right? So when I speak about the far right has become mainstream, it means mostly that it now is a party which is seen as other parties. And on certain fields, they own it, they're seen as dominant. In others, they don't play a major role. But the same happens for the Greens. Right? The Greens are also believed on certain issues, not on others. That's the first thing. Consequently, it would not surprise us that clear boundaries no longer exist. This is an example of the Front National and the UMPS, which the French right-wing parties change their name every decade or so. So this would now be Les Républicains. Now, if you compare in the 1980s, the mainstream right and the far right in France, they were miles apart. They also would not work together under any circumstances. If you compare Les Républicains today with the Rassemblement National, the successor, then you see almost identical narratives, particularly again on immigration. Politically, as said, we had what was called a cordon sanitaire in the 80s, 90s, which meant that other parties did not make government coalitions with the far right. In Western Europe, there was only one government in the third phase that had a far right party, and that was the first Berlusconi government, which in all ways was already different, which had the Lega Nord, which was kind of a borderline party. There was a whole debate about whether they were radical right or they were regionalist. Today, the majority of EU member states have or have had a far-right party in national or subnational governments. So both have changed. Ideologically, the difference are not that big. Just think about, at the moment, we have Starmer, an allegedly left-wing leader, going to Italy to learn immigration policy from the far-right Prime Minister Meloni. Right? We actually have Dutch far-right leaders who want to copy the Danish social democratic immigration policy. So this idea that far-right politics is here, and then here you have mainstream politics, just doesn't work. Far-right politics, particularly on immigration, but also on some other issues, are everywhere. And at the same time, as said, in most countries, the far-right is a partner. And even in some countries where they are not, quite often the argument is not ideological, it's practical. Good example from my country, the Netherlands, which is a wonderful kind of laboratory of far-right politics and mainstream failure, is that just recently the government fell, which was inevitable, and the mainstream party, the conservative party, let's say the Dutch ÖVP, said, we're not going to govern with Wilders anymore, the far-right leader. Not because he's a racist, but he's unreliable. That is the problem. The difference between conservatism and far-right have become very difficult to distinguish. Right? You might recognize someone there. Right? Sebastian Kurz, who's big hero, Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte. Right? Two very good examples of right-wing politicians who would very easy move between far right and mainstream right. A better example is the US, probably the Heritage Foundation, which for a long time was kind of the intellectual think tank of conservatism. Under particularly its new leader, Kevin Roberts, he wrote a very interesting essay about what is conservatism, and that was almost like the point by point my definition of the far right. And so you see that also in the transformation of conservative parties like Fidesz, PIS, Likud, Republican Party, not to say that they didn't have elements of the far right before, but at the moment, whereas before they might have been conservative parties with far-right elements, at best now they are far-right parties with conservative elements. But there's another thing that is shifting, and I think that is less seen. I would say we still have very few truly extreme right parties or politicians, in the sense that they openly are anti-democratic and they openly want to create a different regime. Remember, this is what was very core to the agenda of fascism, historical. But of course, it was a very different time. Democracy was untested, was unpopular. Today, what we see is politicians saving democracy from itself. Right? And so people like Trump, like Orban, are undermining or trying to even destroy democracy in the name of saving democracy. Consequently, they still talk as radical right, but they act as extreme right. Just think about what Orban has done to the Hungarian state, but think about Trump's support for the coup d'etat of January 6th, as well as all kind of other authoritarian measures at the moment in California, for example. So the boundaries between both the mainstream right and the far right are unclear, but also within the far right, between the radical right and the extreme right. Now, a bit nerdy on the Downesian paradigm. This is also called the economic theory of democracy. And Anthony Downes is an economist who had a theory about democracy, which was about the US, but as a consequence believed to explain everything. And very simply stated, he argued that the people, the vast majority of the population, are moderate, and they're in the middle. Which means that moderate politics wins, which leads to centripetal movements, which is his argument. That's why the Republican Party and the Democratic Party go to the middle, because that's where it is. And the consequence is that extreme politics loses because there are no voters on the side. It's amazing how dominant this thinking has been, and even today people will still, in political science, use it. Now, clearly, that's not how it works. While it is true, as Larry Bartels, an American political scientist, recently argued, that the far right didn't come to power by being open about its radical agenda, it did get re-elected in various cases. So Orban, for example, was very vague when he returned to power. It was very clear when he was re-elected for the first time what his agenda was. While people might still have thought in 2016 that either Trump was not so radical as he said or would not have power, by 2020 and certainly 2024, it was absolutely clear what he stood for. And yet, he won, right? And so this idea that you have to moderate, which we still see sometimes when people argue, well, we have to take the far right into the government because then they will have to moderate. Now, first of all, you don't play experiments with national power. But even if you do, it just doesn't work like that because it's not needed. Sensitive point. There is still mass support for democracy. Survey after survey shows 80+% of people saying that they support democracy. However we ask it, if it's the best system, do you support it, blah, blah, blah. The problem is, what does that mean? As so often in politics, we talk about very complex concepts, which are understood in many different ways. To a certain extent, what we measure, I think, in those surveys is whether democracy is still perceived as positive, kind of social desirability. What we know actually from recent studies that ask a little bit better questions is that support for liberal democracy is not that high. Not in the 80s. It depends on the country, it depends on the specific questions. Minority rights, very sensitive, particularly if it's about Muslims, for example. We find in recent studies pretty huge support among people for policies that restrict the rights of certain groups as long as the leader delivers the goods that they want. So by and large, if a politician gives you what you want, US case, lower taxes, then it's fine that they undermine minority rights or rule of law. We found this not just in Latin America, but also in the US. I'm absolutely certain it will be in Europe, not just Eastern Europe, Central Eastern Europe, also Western Europe. Now, democracy is still the norm, which is why even anti-democrats like Orban and Trump have to present themselves as Democrats. To a certain extent, people still want to be Democrats, right? At the same time, you see worrying trends among masses and elites. And this is important because the theory which mainstream politicians in particular like to sell, is that we're forced to do this. The people want us to, right? And so this is the idea. The people move to the right, and we're just moving with them. That's democracy. We're representing them. But the people haven't moved to the right. That is very clear within the EU and the US. the people are, to a large extent, at the same spot on almost every issue related to nativism, authoritarianism, populism. If anything, population has become a little bit more progressive simply by generational change. Overall, young people, yes, still today, despite Joe Rogan, are more progressive than older people. Older people die, more young people vote, and so you have change. So individuals don't change. And I find that always fascinating, how people think that someone who is 70 or something is going to massively change on certain visions. People roughly stay the same, but the electorate changes. And it's something else that we often forget when we talk about politics and we compare an electorate from 30 years ago with today and think that these are the same people. At best, that is, 50% or something, the same electorate? The rest is just different. So change is different. This has major consequences for the fight against the far right. And I see this all the time. Coming out of the Netherlands in the 80s, I'm a product of endless campaigns for multiculturalism and all these kind of things. What Germans call politische Bildung. And I don't know how much money was spent on that. Clearly it didn't work too well, given what happened in the 21st century. Right? But we still see it today. And I have some colleagues in the US who do really fantastic work, and I don't say this sarcastically or just to set them up to then shoot them down. I really like it. It's politische Bildung work. And they say, we should do this campaign, we should do that campaign. And I always tell them, those campaigns are illegal in my state. You can't do these campaigns in Georgia. The campaigns that we talk about often for tolerance, against racism, whatever, much of the mainstream right won't support them because they believe that it's also against them, or they actually don't think that is racism, right? And so we still talk about politics as if it is the 1980s, the 1990s, in which time actually people were less progressive, but also less assertive. And I think that is something that changed. And there's a new book on the normalization of the far right by Vicente Valentin, which is really brilliant and which explains kind of how people have not so much changed their view, they have changed the opinion that they can express their view. Whereas in the 1980s, when you were far right, you kind of understood that you shouldn't say this. The social costs were high. Today, you know that that's fine. You pay the price for it. So we must rethink, but what should we rethink and how? Now, obviously, I don't have all those answers, but the first one is our idea of far-right politics. One of the things that we have very strong, and I see that among students, very strong about among journalists, but also politicians, the far right is always there. So at the beginning of my far-right politics course in Georgia, I always ask people, do you know anyone who's far-right? It's remarkable how few people say yes. I live in a state that's 50-50, right? Halfway the course, I hear my students talk about their dad having a Trump calendar up in their room. And I'm like, but I asked, do you know someone who is far-right? But the far-right's not your dad. The far right is some marginal skinhead far away, right? And that externalization of the far right is a major problem. You saw that under Biden, for example, with his domestic extremism agenda. The far right was not the Republican Party. The far right was the alt-right and some neo-Nazis. The far right comes never from mainstream parties, right? So while we're overcritical of the far right, if they have some policy, let's say, in favor of world peace, we're all going to think, well, there must be a catch, right? If some mainstream party has a vicious nativist policy, like the Danish Social Democrats, we always come up with arguments that it's not really meant. Well, they do that because they have to, otherwise the far right will win. They don't really believe that. really, because they've been at it for 3 decades. So probably they have something with it. So we shouldn't think about far right here, mainstream here. Right? The far right policies and ideas are everywhere, and they're as problematic coming out of the mainstream as they are when they come out of the far right. The concept of the mainstream is also problematic. Now, as an academic who writes in newspapers, words are always very problematic because we understand the meaning of them and the power of them, but at the same time, we only have 800 words to make an argument. And you can't define every word. So we talk about established parties, mainstream parties. But we talk about mainstream parties, in many cases, who have not been in power for 3 decades. While the actual mainstream is the far right. Like, who's the mainstream party in Hungary? Well, it's clearly Fidesz. Right? PIS in Poland. Republicans, Trumpian Republicans, are part of the mainstream in the US. And so the term mainstream is problematic because it has a connotation. Just as moderate, which is something that the New York Times loves, and like everyone wants to be the moderate. Right? Now, completely meaningless term, but to a large extent, mainstream is too. But mainstream is maybe meaningless in terms of what it means, but in terms of connotation, it's strong. Mainstream is good. Mainstream is moderate. You can trust the mainstream. So they won't do anything weird. They do. We have to rethink our assumptions about politics. As said, like, there is no longer a liberal democratic hegemony, if it ever was there. I would rather say the liberal democratic hegemony can no longer be enforced. People will simply not accept it anymore. And so you can't just base yourself on the idea that everyone supports pluralism, everyone is against discrimination, whatever. They're not. They're simply not. And so you have to make an argument why. Right? The idea that politics is, in the end, all about compromises, that people want that, it's not true. Even though, weirdly enough, I just saw an article, a poll again showed that the vast majority of people want that people work together. But what polls also show is that they don't like when their party compromises on the core point. So they want us to work together, but also not make compromises on real essential points. So, and this goes actually to the core of politics. Right? Politics is about making choices. Politics is about making some people happier than other people. And it is about struggle, be it class struggle, national struggle, whatever struggle. And that has to be brought back. This is a longer point, a bit of a pet peeve, but we also really should move away from looking all the time back to explain what happens. Yes, it's true. You can always look back and see something that also happened 100 years ago. And in fact, you can almost always find that what is happening today that you don't like also happened during Nazi Germany. It doesn't mean that that happened then because it was specific to Nazi Germany. Most of these things just happened in the 1930s everywhere, and others were part of a very long tradition of Völkisch nationalism and other things. The most important difference with the 1930s specifically are, first of all, and they're related, democracy was untested and unpopular in the 1920s, 1930s. That is absolutely different. Even if people are now increasingly unhappy with it, they still want democracy. They just want a better one than they have now. But it is still, in that sense, hegemonic. The second, the far right is not openly anti-democratic. And so the 1930s were, to a certain extent, very easy. You had one model here, one model there. Today, we have models that are intertwined. And it's very hard to argue why, if you go one step further, you're no longer liberal democratic. But we also should move from the 1980s, 1990s, the third phase. The far right is not anymore outside. They're not new. They're not challengers. They are actually shaping European politics from within. And finally, a more political point. But we have to change how to fight. While I'm all with the larger anti-fascist fight, although I don't think we're fighting fascism, but let's use that generically, we have to fight for something, not just against something. We've had campaign after campaign, particularly in countries like France, where in the second round, and here, although it is like when you have a winner takes all and a runoff system, like you often get into these campaigns that are just negative. You vote against someone, right? And so the far right is defeated every single time. But democracy isn't strengthened. Because the agenda that is the liberal democratic agenda is a negative agenda. And I give the example of Brexit referendum very often. Right? You had the Remain camp and the Leave camp. The Leave camp actually had a very empowering message. Take back control. Right? Now, it might be wrong, but it gives you something positive. The Remain camp was, we have to stay in the EU, otherwise there will be World War III. I mean, that's terrifying, but not empowering. And importantly, in negative campaigns, as soon as you have the elections and you have won, the connection between you and the person you voted for, the cause you voted for, is gone. Once people had elected Macron, his job was done. He had defeated Marine Le Pen. There's no other connection between the voter and Macron, which means that whatever else he tries to do, he doesn't find a majority. So what we need to do is fight for liberal democracy. By definition, if you fight for liberal democracy, if you make liberal democracy stronger, the far right gets weaker. Now, what is essential for that is that we understand what liberal democracy is. And again, it is stunning how little politicians talk about that. They use democracy all the time, but democracy always in a very narrow term. It's the people decide, blah, 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 which they never really do. But it's not about that you don't get everything you want, that you're not actually allowed to get everything you want, because that's the essence of liberal democracy. It is majority rule and minority rights. It is constrained state power, right? And so it is important that politicians understand what the essence of liberal democracy is, because otherwise you also can't defend it. Now, I don't want to say that the ÖVP ever wanted to defend liberal democracy, but it was very clear that they were not very good at it when they were together with the FPÖ in the government. If you saw what Kiko was doing at the interior minister, you would kind of, alarm bells would have had to go off. Not because you thought like, well, that looks corrupt. No, that goes to the essence of rule of law, of countering powers. Right? If you look at how lame the defense of the Democratic Party is, for example, at the moment in the US, like a lot has to do, I think, with the minimal interpretation of democracy. At election night, it was declared that Trump had won the popular mandate. Right? Now, even if he had won 80% of the vote, in a liberal democracy, that doesn't mean that you can trample on minority rights. That doesn't mean that you can take away independence of judiciary or media. Right? And so I think it is very important that, yes, we focus on far-right politics, wherever it comes from. the far right or mainstream parties. But it is even more important that we come up with a positive agenda, but an honest agenda that explains why liberal democracy is the best system, which in my case is actually risk aversion. And there are all kind of political psychology theories that show that risk aversion is very popular and many people are afraid of losing stuff. That's what liberal democracy is about. Liberal democracy is about that you never lose everything. Sure, you cannot win everything, but you can also never lose basic rights. And if you explain that, I think that you can win the vast majority of the people. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And because I want really to have much more time for all of you to enter conversation, I'll just make two things, because you're right. Democracy is when you're losing elections, you're not losing everything. Your freedom, your property, and when you're winning, you're not winning much. But the story is that democracy also cannot work if basically, nevertheless, who comes to government, nothing change. When both the stakes, when they're very low or when they're very high, democracy cannot work. Because listen, if I'm changing a government and nothing is changing, why to vote? And in my view, this comes the problem where you have a strong consensual politics for 2 or 3 decades, then basically you start trying to go the stakes higher and higher, but the stakes going higher and higher becomes a big problem, because suddenly you start to fear that if you're going to lose elections, you're going to lose everything. And I'm saying this because what I like particularly in your presentation is we're not talking about the far right, we're talking about the transformation of European democratic politics. And the far right is the way to understand this. It's not about particular group of people, it's not about particular group of countries, something is changing. And here's my story, is it not what is changing the idea of the future? Because I do believe that future is this invisible institution in democracy that makes this type of risk averse possible. Because we are going to not solve some problem today, but we are going to solve it tomorrow. Tomorrow can be very different than today, and basically we can dream about different tomorrows. 2 things are changing. When suddenly you believe that there is no time, they could be for different reasons. By the way, if you're a climate activist, you know that basically future probably is a problem, because if certain policies are not going to be done today, tomorrow is going to be too late. And on the right, you have a very strong fear coming from the demographic anxiety. Basically, if you start to view every elections as the last elections, this cannot work. And in my view, this is changing, and this temporality of democracy is changing, and this is why party starts to move. And I do believe you are very convincing when you are trying to see that this is a new consensus. People start to perceive politics differently. And here's my major question. In situations like this, when you hit this major polarization, who stands for the neutral institutions? For example, when you say rule of law, suddenly you stop to see them like this. Mr. Kaczynski had a very important term which he introduced when for the first time he came to power, and this was legal impossibilism. You see, you come to power, you voted, and you cannot do anything, because the central bank is not allowing you to do economic policies, the judges are not allowing this and that. I'm sure that now when Donald Tusk came back to power, he can say the same, because basically you have a courts that have been appointed by other people who are basically playing an openly political game. And my question to you is the following. I agree with you, liberal democracy is very much about constraints. How it is going to be communicated to the people if they more and more start to see neutral institutions as a kind of a political institutions controlled by one or the other political parties? You can, and this is, in my view, something that has changed, and this is radical change by kind of a much more political story that we remember before, where part of these neutral institutions were there simply because of the traumatic experience of the 1920s and 1930s. So is it not that liberal democracy is very much based on a certain type of a psychological state of mind, which has changed because this trauma of the wars, trauma of kind of a cost of radical politics has disappeared.
I think the Second World War trauma played a major role in certain countries. It was much stronger in Germany and the Netherlands, for example, than in Italy or Austria. But I think there was something else that had a similar effect, and that was a kind of an elitist understanding of politics, which was not just conservatism, but you had paternalism in social democracy, which was shared, like in the because this idea that the institutions, and to a certain extent the people who were in the institutions, took care of us, predates the Second World War. It was the foundation of social democrats, conservatives, Christian Democrats, and of the people, because we lived in a kind of a vertical relationship in terms of rulers and ruled. The ones that were ruled believed that, the vast majority believed that the rulers knew better. In the 1960s, 70s, we went to a more horizontal society, which is much more difficult to manage, right? Because now you have people who say, but why, right? Politicians says we have to do that. In 1920s, say, okay. 1960s, you ask why, right? I come from the Netherlands. We question everything, right? But then in the 1980s, 90s, you get neoliberalism. Now, neoliberalism is an economic system I find much less interesting. As an ideology, I think is very powerful. In neoliberalism, first of all, the state is weak, inefficient, right? And so the state as an actor becomes problematic, which includes judges as well. It's not just politicians. Right? But more importantly, in the market, the client is the king, the customer is king. When politicians started to treat voters as customers, we got into a new vertical relationship where the voter, the ruled, was above the ruler. Now, obviously, there's window dressing. Most politicians didn't actually do that, but they told voters, you know, right? You know what's good for us, and we will create that for you. What populism did was added a moral distinction to that, where this vertical relationship with the ruled above the rulers now became pure versus evil, right? And that plays, and so as a consequence, institutions are now seen as being used by bad people, but there is a bad and a good element in it. Like when you read about democratic theory in the utopian way speaks about that independent critical citizen. That's allegedly who we want, someone who actually makes decisions for themselves. And turns out it's very hard to have a democracy with people like that. But where I think the mismatch is that politicians, while talking about, and again, like Rutte is a perfect example of speaking about citizens as as the citizen, as this much smarter person than the politician who can take their own responsibility, do stuff, right? Of course, in the end, they never really give them that power. And I think one of the interesting things is you see this come out, and I'm still fascinated by COVID politics, because it is increasingly clear that it has changed things, but it's also unclear what and how. But I was thinking about that in light of the Netherlands, where we've had neoliberalism in this ideological idea of the citizen knows better than the politician for decades, where we have dismantled the welfare state pretty much from that perspective, like you understand how to spend your money. And then out of nowhere, like you have COVID measures. Now, COVID measures were extreme, but COVID measures would not have created the same effect in the 1960s. Because in the 1960s, people wouldn't have second-guessed politicians. Today, they do. And that doesn't mean that they're unmanageable, but it does mean that you have to have a much better discourse. And so what you talked about earlier is kind of Tina politics. There is no alternative. Like, I think there always are alternatives, but I also think that this argument about what Blair, for example, said about globalization, right? Yes, you cannot escape globalization. Obviously, there are various forms of globalization. More importantly, you can actually change almost everything. Right? The point is, the price is often far too high. And so, for example, Brexit, we have said forever, you can't leave the EU. It's impossible. I mean, that was a lie. You could leave it. As more and more Brits now find out, the price is actually much higher. And so that is, I think that we have gotten into this pragmatic discourse where we argue on the basis of, like, this can be done, this can be done, this is efficient, this is efficient. Many people don't care about efficiency, right? At the same time, if you tell them, like, sure, you don't like the EU, but if you get out, you have to do this, this, and this, and that. Then they will probably say, okay, I'll stay, right? And so for me, the death penalty is another thing. Like, there's surprising support for the death penalty. We never talk about it. And if it ever is raised, most politicians say, well, you can't do that because then you can't be in the EU or the Council of Europe. This is a dumb argument, right? I mean, then you get out of the Council of Europe. Logically, that's what someone says. But that's not the reason why we don't have the death penalty, right? So you explain it. And so for me, that's about the re-ideologization of politics. I think the problem of contemporary politics is that everything is pragmatic, and it believes in neutrality, which I think doesn't exist. But what pragmatism does is that it solves problems. But politics is about defining what is a problem and what is not a problem. And this is where the power of the far right, for example, is so strong. It is the far right that says we have an immigration problem. And then it's the mainstream that says we're going to solve that. And they think we are following our agenda, right? But the agenda setting is in what is the problem, first and foremost.
Thank you very much. I'll go this, but just tempted on two things. So basically, listening to you, this is a democratization of society that is doing this. You have a better educated people. Secondly, science works like this. Doctors disagree. And when when you have one doctor in the village, you're following what the doctor is telling you. But you have several doctors, you have Google, you check, and so on. So why to trust? And if this is the case, and also opening of the system, I remember talking to a very senior Republican after Trump was elected for the first time and said, is the Republican elite going to handle him? And he gave me, in my view, a profound answer. He said, if it was 20 years ago, for sure, because we were a coherent elite. We were coming from the same families, studying in the same universities, and you can do this. But he said even Republican Party became much more democratic. We are not going to be able to do this. I'm saying this because in a strange way, for me, the most important is people have changed, society has changed, and we're trying to understand how basically democracy is going to change too. So from this point of view, to defend what was the model that worked, for example, 30 years ago, for me is simply unattainable. Certain things are going to be defended and certain things are going to change. And even on the level of re-ideologization, I do believe it's very important, but then the view of the neutral institutions is going to be different. You cannot talk, and I'm very much on your side, you cannot say people. We have now debate in Bulgaria about the euro. And we are saying that because we said 10 years ago that we are joining the euro, there is no need to have a discussion now. So we're going out of the substantial debates, and then people start to see this as a kind of elite conspiracy. and you're going to this kind of a populist zeitgeist that you identified 20 years ago. I'm saying this because I want to go to the conversation, but for me the most important about your lecture is that focusing on the far right and believing that the only problem to confront and stop the far right is how to defend the status quo that does not exist anymore. In my view, if we're not going to ask the question how liberal democracies are going to change, trying to remain liberal democracies is a different question. And please, now it's your turn to ask much more important questions. Please. Yeah, please. Can you just introduce yourself?
Bill Spiegelberger, American lawyer. I live here, but I've lived around as well. To what can we give the far right or the medium far right any credit for at least, say, talking about what's bothering people? And I say this as someone on the left. I would characterize myself as a Roosevelt Democrat. But I get the impression the right is talking about things that are bothering the population, I'm talking about the United States, more than the left.
Okay, yes and no, but I think there were, if you look at Europe, for example, Europe in the 1980s, various countries, the elite had either implicitly or explicitly made a pact not to talk about immigration or European integration. And the simple reason was they knew very well that their electorates were divided over these issues. And so none of the big parties had an interest in making this important. In certain countries, as a consequence, what they did is externalize it by making referendums over EU membership, right? So yes, I think they help put these on the agenda. I think the idea that the left doesn't talk about things that are of concern to people, first of all, people are concerned about things that the media are concerned about. And we have very good research on that. If you talk a lot, if the media reports a lot about the environment, then the people are very concerned about the environment. If you talk a lot about immigration, they're a lot. They also help shape what we think about something, right? It's not to say that everything is created, because it's interactive, but we know, and also who are the people, right? And so one of the things that we find in some research is that there are huge gender differences. There are, of course, generational differences. Politics is almost always about old men. And if you look at the interests and the priorities of old men, they're very different from young women. So immigration, for example, is a top issue among men, and often older men. It doesn't rank often among women, not even older men. It's not to say that women are not nativist. In fact, in terms of nativism, men and women are equally nativist. It's not a top priority. And so the left, whatever is left of it, does talk about issues that are very high on the agenda of a lot of people. Housing, education, healthcare. But somehow media and other politicians are uninterested in talking about that. And so I'm not saying that the far right is, there are no conspiracy theories here, right? I mean, the media is not creating something, they're also mostly played, and no one has full control. But there is a misunderstanding that there is a kind of a natural hierarchy of priorities that is internal in people. It is an interplay. And the fact that we endlessly talk about immigration crises means that people want that solved. If we would talk about climate change in the same way, then that would be what people want to see solved. So yes, already in the 1980s, someone argued that the far right raises the right questions but provides the wrong answers, right? And I think that has been the case in certain ways. I think the 21st century is different, though. I mean, let's face it, if we're currently thinking about the US, I mean, the far right is raising questions that are insane, that have nothing to do anymore with what people are concerned about. But you can make people concerned. Right? It's not that white evangelicals in the US just woke up at a certain point in time and thought, yeah, you know what, we are the most discriminated people. That is decades of Christian radio and talk radio, et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you. Please.
Thank you. My name is Aaron Taus. I work at the Institute for Social Change and Sustainability at the Economics University here in Vienna. And thank you for your talk. I have one comment and one question actually, and two comments. At least once or twice you mentioned the concept of hegemony at passing during your talk, and it made me think of all the theoretical work that Antonio Gramsci provided us with, especially in his prison notebooks, that I think are still insightful and enlightening for understanding not only the rise of fascism during his times in the 1920s and 1930s, but also for understanding the relationship between, on the one hand, economic crisis, class rule, and political crisis, right? The rise of the anti-capitalist left. And second, even more so, I would argue, is another historical materialist thinker, Nikos Poulantzas, his work on fascism and dictatorships in Germany, Italy, but also especially in the 1970s in Portugal, Spain, and Greece. And his conceptual framework, I remember you mentioned crisis is such a vague term. I think he provides us with a really, I would say, insightful conceptual framework distinguishing between economic crisis, political crisis, crisis of the state, hegemonic crisis, which is, I would say, much more insightful and enlightening than idealist, liberal, or politicist or psychologistic frameworks that part of, let's say, the common sense today. So I was wondering if you have taken a look at these sort of concepts by Gramsci and Poulantzas, because what I was missing, to be honest, in your talk were two things. And you abstracted from the specific economic context now, which you call the fourth wave of the far right, which I would call the crisis of neoliberal financialized capitalism. And at the same time, what I didn't understand is what's your concept of the state? Because I think what's really important is to go beyond this liberal concept of the state as a neutral actor and understand that, let's say, these correlation of social forces and class forces also inscribed in the state and are never abstract from socioeconomic developments in the past 10, 15 years. And the last point I would say is, if you want to really understand the rise of the far right and the importance of migration, what is hardly discussed is the function that migration, especially in Europe, but also in the United States, plays for the dynamics and let's say the dynamics of, let's say, the accumulation of capital. To what extent migration is really sustaining a certain model of accumulation. Thank you.
Kirsty has a question. If somebody else has, after Kirsty, because to have all the questions together, because the good news which I kept for the end is that they're going to be wine and cheese after this. So, Kirsty.
Kirsty Lang, I'm a journalist, British journalist. I was told by a senior British civil servant quite soon after the Brexit referendum that there was a big the biggest correlation that they could see of voters was between those people who believed in the death penalty. If you believed in the death penalty, you were far more likely to vote for Brexit. And I wondered what you would read into that. And the other thing is whether you had any thoughts on, there was a recent survey in the UK, but it also correlates with what we saw in the US during the last election, a rise in young people, particularly young men, losing faith in democracy. And I wonder if you had some thoughts on that.
Can I take these?
There is some urgent last question. Oh, sorry, please, I haven't seen it. Yeah, here it is.
Can I have your pen?
My name is Diana, and I'm
Have your pen? Your pen.
my name is Diana, and I'm a bachelor student at University of Applied Arts here in Vienna. And my friend and I were discussing yesterday that there are countless examples in history when authoritarianism and fascism came into the country through relatively fair elections, and there are even recent examples of that. And usually, when people talk about fair elections, they point out 2 points, that we need to have more people show up to elections to vote, and that we need to increase transparency of the vote count. But it's clear with each day that it's not enough to establish fair elections. What do you think are some other points that needs to be mentioned that people usually underestimate when it comes to establishing fair democratic elections nowadays?
Thank you very much. If it's very short. Medium is not good enough. Please, CAS.
Okay, I will work backwards. So the idea for a long time was that the far right only wins when there is low turnout, when few people are engaged. That has been proven wrong on various occasions. The far right has done very well, most recently in Poland. Almost record turnout, far right wins. While the far right has won in free and unfair elections, like Orban pretty much every re-election, he won the first one in fair elections. The far right has won in most cases in fair elections, namely when they were not in power. Fair elections in itself is a far more complex term than we throw it around as if it's like really simple, but if you actually look at what that means, then there's almost no fair election around. But obviously there are gradations there. I don't personally think that fair elections are the big problem. In the vast majority of countries, at the very least, the elections are not much less fair now than they were when the far right didn't win. The myth of the young men, first of all, I just wrote a column about this for The Guardian a while back. I think there's a problem with the male gaze, right? For me, the interesting thing is actually not young men, but young women. What we do see is that the largest gap in terms of both voting, but particularly attitudes, gender gap, is among the young. Right? But that is not because the young men have gone to the right, it's because young women have gone to the left. And so young men are a little bit more progressive, if you want, than older men. Young women are far more progressive than older women. That is the story. Right? And then you have a completely different story. And we're no longer talking about Joe Rogan, or Andrew Tate, or the far right for that matter. What we then should talk about is, why is no one offering them an agenda? Like, young women also vote less than young men. So there's actually more to gain, right? Now, what electoral research shows is that young men actually don't vote more for the far right, but they consider voting more for the far right. And that's an important difference, and a temporal difference. So it means at the moment, they still vote for whatever, but they consider the far right as an option. Now, we can go back and forth about that, but that is actually not so confusing, I think, because if you are 35 or younger, you're a product of the normalization of the far right. You have your whole adult life, right? You have seen discourses on migration where the difference between the mainstream and the far right are marginal. And then you hear people say, don't vote for them, they're completely different. That discourse doesn't make sense to them. That makes sense for people who have experienced the 80s, 90s. But for the young, like, that is just the most radical version from the normal parties, right? But the one that my dad doesn't like. So, like, I can still shock a little bit. And I don't want to minimize it, because having the far right in your consideration set means that in a couple of elections, you are probably going to vote for them. But it's not there yet. And as said, more importantly, men are not more radical right. Even in terms of their sexism, for example. There was just another poll that said that young men see less discrimination of women than older men, right? The thing is, this is called modern sexism in the literature. The point is not that they are against gender equality. The point is that they think it has been achieved. And that is what they have been told. And that's what they live. Because in schools and universities, and nowadays even in first jobs, women outperform men. Like, they start to lag when the baby penalty comes, right? But nowadays in the US, for example, women graduates get better job offers than men. And so they hear everything and they figure, what is this about? And you can't expect an 18-year-old to think about what happens after women get babies, right? You have to explain to them that the world is not just school and that women still make 78 cents to the dollar, right, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's a different thing. The death penalty in election, I think this just goes back to the work of Adorno in the 1930s and 50s, which we know that there's a lot of different attitudes from let's say, xenophobia to authoritarianism that cluster. And so we call that in political science a proxy, which means that through the death penalty, you measure the position on Brexit. It isn't necessarily connected. You are not for or against Brexit because of your position on the death penalty, but you have a position on the death penalty because of an underlying attitude, be that authoritarianism, and that is also the reason why you are for Brexit. Finally, Marxism, sorry, but I'm going to conflate it there. I'm just not convinced that it is socio-economic, that it is economic. We have had economic crises that were absolutely fundamental, that didn't lead to the far right rising. The oil crisis being the best example, but even the Great Depression, because everyone always talks about Weimar Germany, but Weimar Germany was the exception, not the rule. The fascism won almost nowhere, anywhere above single digits. The Great Recession did not, in the short term, lead to a rise of the far right. The far right existed before. In this country, I think the record was still 1999 or slightly above that. It's also, for the same reason, not social media. Bummer, but the far right already predates social media. It's not that they are not important, but what is important about and we know this from research too, it's relative deprivation, not absolute deprivation. It is that you feel economically deprived, not whether you are, and that is created irrespective of whether the objective economic situation is whatever it is. We know that from research on Trump, for example, that the vast majority of people who vote for Trump are fine with their own economic situation. They think that the country's economic situation is going wrong. I think there, again, and I'm much more ideological than economical, I think that the Great Recession was very important because what I would say neoliberal hegemony as this idea that the market is better than the state and the neoliberal, the global market provides always grows, that disappeared, right? And so until that could not be challenged by and large. Now we live in the weird situation, and we do that in many ways, that we have all kind of systems that have kind of failed or not delivered, or are set to have not delivered, but they're still there. Multiculturalism, everyone says it's bad, that has failed, but still there. Neoliberalism, pretty much everyone has agreed that that was the core of the Great Recession, but still there. European integration, right? Run out of steam, muddles through, but it's still there. And I think that is much more an explanation of why there is this unhappiness and this feeling that we have to go somewhere else. Again, particularly also what young people do have, they are not necessarily less supportive of democracy. That was very driven by the US, not so much the case in Europe. They do believe that democracy doesn't deliver. But then again, think about if you are under 35, what has it delivered? When I think about what social democracy, for example, has delivered, I don't think about the last couple of decades. Right? I think about the 70s, 80s, for example. And so I think that, to me, that comes back to ideology. Right? In the end, and if you want, like envisioning a new world, right, it's not necessarily a completely different system. I don't think the values have changed. Right? I mean, I'm a social democrat. For me, values is international solidarity, equality, whatever, the foundation of the welfare state, they're all the same. But obviously, the welfare state cannot be shaped in the same way in the 21st century as in the 20th century, where in most cases, the welfare state was built on the patriarchal structure. It was built on heteronormativity. It was also built, and it's a bit of a sensitive term in Europe, on white supremacy. Guest workers were brought to uplift the white working class. You can't do that, but that doesn't mean that you can't create a welfare state. No, you have to make a welfare state for the 21st century. And that will look different, and that will do certain things that will feel as if they're not a real welfare state, but they are the modern interpretation of the old ideals.
Thank you very much. So now I'm going to ask both young women and old men to applaud. Thank you very much. And as I said, you're invited for a wine and cheese downstairs. Thank you so much. It was great.
Thank you, CAS. Well done.
Thank you.